Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So great to see everyone coming in. Thank you so much for being here. Hi, Nikki Robertson. Nice to see you. Wonderful. We'll give a few minutes just to let the last few people we've got in the waiting room come on in. Really grateful to have you all here today. So thank you so much for coming. As you come in, please feel comfortable adding into the chat. A question I have for you today is, where are you joining us from? And where you're from and your culture, what do you typically have for breakfast? What's your typical breakfast food? Oh, you're making me all hungry. That looks amazing. Thank you so much. Wonderful. All right, as people continue to come in, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Laurel Ramirez, and I'm the head of school here at UWC Thailand. It's a real honor and a pleasure to welcome you all today. We have a really interesting webinar in the works for you on diversity and why it matters, some perspectives from some different members of our UWC community. Before I start out the webinar for today, introducing you to our three guest speakers, I wanted to cue you in a bit to some of the invitations I might offer to you for today's webinar. Just as you're doing now in the chat for those coming in, thank you for telling us where you're connecting from and what you most enjoy culturally for breakfast. That's a fantastic beginning to our webinar today. You can also then throughout the webinar use that chat to engage with our presenters. So if you're connecting with anything that our presenters are saying and you'd like to add anything in to the webinar, please do so in the chat. We'll also be holding a question and answer section of the webinar at the end of our session today. So there'll be time as well if you have some really important questions you'd like to ask or specific follow-ups you'd like to do with any of our presenters. Feel free to put those into the chat at any time. We'll scroll back through and pull questions out of the chat for our question and answer session as well. There's emojis at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you would like to engage with our presenters by showing them a little bit of love in that emoji land, please feel free to do that. If you agree, if you want to give them a thumbs up, we're always welcome to that positive feedback. So anything you might want to add there, we're always happy to have. All right, let's go ahead and spotlight our three presenters, Colin, if you can. And I'd like to introduce you to our three speakers for today. First off, we've got Ken Kuguru, who is the CEO and co-founder of Love Handle, Asia's first digital-led plant-based butcher. Prior to founding Love Handle, Ken was the managing director for Expedia's Asia Pacific corporate travel business, where he sat on Expedia's Diversity and Inclusion Global Council, after which he joined UWC's Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Steering Committee. Before joining Expedia, Ken was CEO of the Java House Group, guided the organization through the largest F&B private equity deal in the history of East Africa. I'm tired even just reading all of that, Ken. You must be exhausted. Ken has over 20 years of experience in Asia, the US, and Africa, along with other emerging markets, having worked for Philips Electronics in mainland China for over 10 years. You might be wondering, who is Ken in his self? Well, he's a native English speaker, fluent in Mandarin and conversational in Swahili. He's also a 2003 graduate of the Michigan Ross School of Business and an avid, albeit high handicapped golfer. We've also got guest speaking today, Amanda Molnar, who is an international educator and teacher leader for 9 years, holding a master's in education for change with a focus on social justice education. Amanda's master's research focused on decolonizing international education, and she is currently teaching business, economics, and global politics here at UWC Thailand, and is the teacher support for the student-run diversity committee in the secondary school. And last but not least, we have Cece Ovelar. Cece is a third culture kid, having grown up in the United States, Paraguay, and Brazil. He teaches primary art, has a bachelor's in cultural anthropology and a master's in education from the United States. And he has been a professional artist and muralist for the last 15 years, painting large murals all over the world in Brazil, Spain, the United States, China, Cambodia, Cape Verde, Paraguay, Malaysia, Nepal, Nigeria, and Thailand. He's been living here in Thailand for the last 11 years, previously teaching art in the Australian International School of Bangkok and Webster University. Coming from an art background, which focuses a lot on cultural issues and community building, Cece's art lessons focus a lot on the humanities and traditional arts. Cece enjoys spending time with his family, listening to world music, painting, having philosophical conversations, studying anthropology, swimming in the ocean, and riding bikes with his son. So we're very pleased to have our guest speakers here today, hoping that this will be a stimulating conversation on why diversity matters in our field of education. And to get us going and to frame our conversation, I'm going to invite us to all come to a shared definition of what diversity, equity, and inclusion will mean for our speakers in our presentation today. So if we think about what DEI is, I'm going to draw your attention to a shared definition I'm going to suggest, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion being a term used to describe policies and programs that promote the representation and participation of different groups of individuals, including people of different ages, races, and ethnicities, as well as abilities and disabilities, genders, religions, cultures, and sexual orientations. So knowing there can always be a myriad of definitions out there, I think it's important we come together with that shared definition as we then head into our first guiding question for our panelists. So panelists, can you please share with us, why do you see DEI mattering in your sphere of influence? Knowing that it looks different depending on where you stand, whether that's your position in an organization or literally where you are. Why does DEI matter in your sphere?
Yeah, so happy to jump in. Thanks, Laurel, for such a wonderful introduction. I think the slides are going to update, reflect that question, and if folks don't, kind of need a reminder what that is. So from my point of view, just, as a reminder, so I'm currently in the business world. So I'm, running a kind of a plant-based business, and what does that have to do with racism or anti-racism? I'm also on the board of or the anti-racism group for UWC. So obviously that has more direct correlation. So I have to think about it from both my business angle as well as from the direct board that I sit on. Also from my cultural background, I'm from originally from East Africa, but lived in Asia most of my life, but I'm also US. So all these different backgrounds play into how I would think about this question. So from my point of view, like, first of all, as an American, as a US citizen, we always kind of recognize that racist events and massive world movements, people kind of see the US as a center of a lot of those activities, and the flip side is that Americans, like people like me, will recognize racism as being very alive and real and impacting the way our lives on a daily basis. And then the flip side, unfortunately, is that many people will say that maybe racism doesn't impact them, or diversity issues don't impact them outside the US. Like it's an American problem. So I think first of all, I would say that lessons from the US is that we have been inundated by diversity and racial issues for centuries, and so these inequalities basically have become what we call systemic, right? So they become part of our system, and then impact people who maybe aren't racist themselves, and impact systems and processes for people that never meant to have any kind of inequality, or never would stand for any inequality. But then because of the systemic issues, because of the systems and policies and procedures, basically make sure that people that are underrepresented remain underrepresented, and people that are doing okay continue to have first advantages throughout life. So I think that, to me, is the main message from the from having a US background and then stepping into an Asian content. What I've seen from a lot of surveys and from a lot of discussions, informal and formal, is that a lot of people in Asia don't actually think that's true in an Asian context, whether it be Singapore or Thailand or China. Most of the markets, don't really recognize it. Like I mentioned earlier, it's maybe a US problem. So I think that's one of the main things I want to just reemphasize, is I don't think it's a US problem. I think that as a representative in the business context and in the UWC context, coming from a global background, I do think that systemic racism exists, everywhere. And I think it's important to raise that awareness. I think that's the first thing I would say. What's important to me in my sphere is really to raise that awareness and to recognize that, yeah, the majority groups in all contexts will probably not immediately recognize that there is an issue. And maybe if there's one idea or one thought I can leave with this group as to why it's important to me, is that, systemic racism by definition is invisible, right? If it was visible and if we were all aware about it, then it really wouldn't be systemic racism. Systemic racism is when the systems and policies and procedures are set up in such a way that the majority continues to be the majority, the well-off continue to be the well-off, the represented continue to be represented, and the opposite is also true. So it's invisible. So I think it's just important that we recognize that these issues affect us whether we are in a school, academic context, whether we are in a business context, whether we're in Asia or whether we're in Europe or the US, these exist, and the people that are underrepresented will be more likely to say that, to understand that it does exist, and maybe be able to give examples and context in which they are impacted. So maybe that's just where I'll leave it as just an opening thought from my end.
Okay, from my point of view, as a teacher in the primary school, and just think about international schools in general, international schools are quite new as a global phenomenon. Like if you look at all of civilization, they've only been really around since the 1960s and 70s. And originally they were built to facilitate an education for diplomats and for business people. However, as the world has changed and now we have more of a globalized society, international schools have become a much more common thing. And you see a lot more people that are engaging in international education. With that, you're having a lot more people that are coming from different parts of the world to be educated together. As they're being educated together, there are a lot of things that are difficult, trying to find a middle ground between values about what's going to be the best way to have an adolescence or to have a childhood that's going to prepare you for the future. As we can see, having this globalized society, a lot of the interactions that we have with each other can be positive or negative depending on how much we actually understand each other. And a lot of the problems in the world can be rooted back to just miscommunication or misunderstanding of different cultures. So as a primary teacher, it's very important for me to have DEI at the top of my thoughts whenever I'm planning things, because I'm trying to prepare my students to become adults that function in this world, that understand where they come from, how they're going to be interacting with other people, and why that's so important. And for the the UWC overall mission, trying to unite different nations and people and cultures together for peace and for sustainability. Sustainability is really rooted in a lot of different systems and groups agreeing to certain terms that are beneficial for everybody. And in order for that to happen, the educational system that we make for them has to mirror kind of like a format of how we can be just between all these different values and perspectives and basically goals that we have in life. So it's very, very important that we provide children today with the tools that will make them successful in the future, whether that be being multilingual, whether that being intercultural, and understanding how different people react and how to modulate or adapt themselves to different situations. We want to make sure that they have the tools as adults to be leaders for this change, to be the people who can actually understand how this format and structure works to unite people around the world. And a lot of that comes with difficult conversations and readjusting around our backgrounds. And that's where the equity and the inclusion comes about. Diversity, obviously international schools will have diversity. We have different ethnicities and nationalities that are in our school. But the equity and the inclusion part is the one that needs a little bit more action from us as educators and from us that are in part of the international school system, to try to think about how can we make it fair for everybody, because as children become adults and go out into the world, they're not going to stay localized in one location. They're going to go back to wherever their home is, or they're going to forge a new home in a new place, and they've got to be able to feel like they're empowered and feel that they have a voice and the ability to make a change. And as the world is slowly moving towards that, we can move with it and move a little bit more progressive and quicker to find ways that we can include everybody in the process of building the world, and really make sure that we give them an ideal scenario or format that can leverage and empower them to become world changers.
Wow. So coming from a different perspective in the sort of diploma level, upper high school, I think I wrote down one of the things that Ken mentioned about place, right? And when we think about DEI, where we stand, Sasay and I are both in Thailand, and really considering that, just like what Ken said, it's not something that comes from one place outward, that we all have to follow this one model that was developed in the West. I mean, I think that's definitely the antithesis of what we're talking about here, but really considering where we stand is very, very important. And in the diploma program at UWC Thailand, we have students from over 50 cultures and countries. And that in and of itself, I could full stop right there. Why does DEI matter in your sphere is because, and you'll see in our next few questions, we are deliberately diverse. And so therefore, we need to actively engage with not just that deliberate diversity, but also the equity and inclusion portions of DEI, right? And we use the IB curriculum here, and it is incredible, but it also is something that needs to be engaged with using this model, because, although the curriculum can be wonderful, we still need to consider where it comes from, and the impact of those legacies on the people that are in our room, remember, being physically there in the space. And with students from so many different places and teachers from so many different places, we need to rumble with tough conversations. We need to be comfortable, especially in the older grades. And that's why, Sasay and I have such good conversations, because we come at it from different places. DEI is incredibly important because we need a framework to rumble with these hard conversations. And the other reason it's so important is that we are, as Sasay said, and as Ken alluded to, we are often in bubbles as international schools. And so really trying to actively, purposefully turn towards bursting that bubble. And this is a way to do that. And just because also it's really important to the students that are in our classrooms. This is something that is important to them. And if we want to honor student voice, it needs to be important for us. So, I mean, that's why DEI is incredibly important where I stand.
Thank you, Ken, Sasay, and Amanda. So it's an interesting question, I guess, for our audience members as well to consider, right? Where do you see this as important in the sphere that you're in? And I'm wondering now, Ken, Sasay, and Amanda, through both educational and more of a corporate sphere, where do you see some opportunities to integrate into programming? I wonder if you can give us some very concrete examples of some integration that you have found successful.
Yeah, so generally with DEI work, there's two aspects that are constantly being developed. One is the internal aspect about how the organization runs and if things are equitable within the actual organization. And then other ones are the actual initiatives and the programs that we're doing with our students to move these things forward. I'm always much more passionate about the programming aspect, even though both of them are very important. I really like to do things that are directly affecting the students and their own learning. And there's plenty of opportunities to integrate DEI stuff into the curriculum of a primary school. Some things that we do in the primary school, language, like the idea of being bilingual or multilingual is very important to us. And we give the students lots of opportunities to develop that. If it's not their mother tongue, it's an additional language, but it's an importance, and we honor that by giving it time in the schedule. That way students can study things. Sorry, Yanka. Sorry. By giving students opportunities to come in contact with other languages and practice them on not just a one-off basis, but steadily throughout the week, giving them many opportunities to study languages. Another thing that we do with the programming is we try to do more cultural initiatives. One thing that we initiated last year, which has been pretty successful with the student engagement, has been creating a world music radio station. So we call it Manta Radio here at the school. And with the students, we explore different songs from different countries. And by finding those songs, unpack the language, unpack the cultural values, unpack the history of it. And it's a very easy way for the students to engage with other cultures that might not be present always in our school, and also for students to feel empowered if they can share their cultures with their friends and teach each other about their own cultures in a way that's more entertaining. The students have really gravitated to that. It's also been a mechanism for a lot of students who are not native speakers to practice their language, whether it's English or other languages, because we have to introduce songs that come from a range of different languages. So it's opportunities for students to always engage with other cultures and learn from them. Another thing that we do, and something that's often kind of ignored with DEI programming, is the inclusion of people who are neuroatypical, so neurodifference. In our school, we have a pretty robust learning support program that's in the primary school, and they work with like an ASDAN program, teaching life skills and things like that, which are enabling students to be able to work on their communication skills, work on social cues, and also for the community to understand how to interact with people who have different ways of processing information. Overall, all these initiatives that we've done have been very well received by the students. I can definitely see as a teacher a lot of things that they've taken away from it, changes in their behavior or their understanding of the world by constantly being able to understand and come in contact with new ideas or new ways of thinking. And we're always looking for new ways to do this. And a lot of times we simply just listen to the students. As the students come in contact with other cultures, we kind of find what information they don't have or what things they're most interested in. And leading by the IB example, we ask questions about that, and we lead the inquiry process to find out more about that. So a lot of it's very natural because we have a lot of students here from a lot of places. Occasionally, some years we'll have new demographics come in, or we may have some students come from one new location or one new nationality, and that's an opportunity for the students to engage with that. And overall, in the primary school at least, I find our DEI programming to be very valuable and very authentic. And we try to find as many opportunities as we can to find more programs like that. But we lead by the students and what their interest is.
Yeah, I think Sesay's point is the summary in big bold letters on my paper is like student led, right? That's the part of it that's really important. And I have way too many things on here to share with all of you about the opportunities, but one of the things is to think about them as these like big picture explicit things that we do, but then also the opportunities in more implicit ways. So the big picture kind of explicit, big loud things we do in the high school are things like having an identity week. So looking at the intersectionality of identities, right? These are not, we are not one thing. All human beings are so multifaceted and so complex. And so when we think about diversity, sometimes we think flags or we think, pride parades. And the intersection of those two things, what does it mean to be a complex individual, to walk through this world? What does it mean to be a third culture kid, as is in Sesay's introduction, right? Those big picture things. And so we spend a week looking at the deep identities of students and having them look at that and reflect and connect. We do professional development for teachers, and I won't take credit for any and all of this. I'm just listing them out, but we had students run professional development last week for our teachers in the secondary about, acknowledging biases in the classroom and acknowledging the way that we might approach issues differently, how to connect better. Those are big issues, but student-led, student-driven, bringing in experts to do this with our staff and doing staff-led things. And we did a culture survey. It's a pretty, simple idea, but it's a big deal. We sat with students and listened to what the issues that they were facing and coded them using research methodology and saw what was the most important and used that to guide our actions going forward, really deeply listening and not being afraid to hear what students have to say is incredibly powerful in DEI work. We also have this sort of, and we do a peace and conflict transformation. There's so many, but we also have these sort of implicit things that happen, the choices that we make in our classrooms on who we highlight, who we talk about, how we talk about things like in the diploma program, how we talk about development. It's a common theme across group 3 where I teach in the individuals and societies, but the way that we talk about these things, the way we talk about, the different nations and cultures in the world, that's an implicit choice that we make to engage with DEI in a real way, in a way that can be decolonizing, in a way that can be activism in its own right, if done properly, right? And supporting student advocacy and acknowledging perspectives in learning, right? And of course, I have not done all of these things at the school, but I can champion them. We have student-led committees that came up out of grassroots. We have a student gender and sexuality group that just sprung up and is so powerful in our school. And that's where the juicy bits are. Those are the opportunities to say, what's important? How can we push it forward? And how can we listen? So, yeah.
Wow. I love the passion. The passion is, I think maybe passion is the best way to integrate, into our curriculum, because that if we all had that kind of passion, Amanda, I think problem solved, right? So I think, just to build on the question and actually build on something Amanda mentioned earlier, she asked a really good question. It's like, where does, first the question we're answering is what should we integrate into our curriculum? And the question Amanda asked, which maybe precedes that question, is, where does our curriculum even come from? And I think it's a great question, right? Because to me, that obviously the origin of anything we consume impacts us and impacts us, so profoundly. And we, again, the whole invisibility, like I mentioned earlier, of systemic racism is impacted by the things we don't see. And one of those things is like the origin of what we consume. So I think the question of where does our curriculum come from is something we should be asking. The current things we study, the things, our academic profile, who wrote those, what part of the world is that coming from, what perspective, all of that has such a profound impact on us, and we often don't even see it and until it's too late. And then we are impacted by those things. So I think we have to ask ourselves the question. I personally have been challenged, beyond curriculum to ask, where does any of the content I consume come from? The things I read in my favorite magazines, who wrote that? Why? What was their objective? The shows we watch on Netflix, who were the producers of those things? We might see the actors, but we don't, who are the writers? Where are they from? The games we play, the programmers, the same question. This is something I've been really challenged in my personal life to look and ask those questions, because I haven't my whole life. I just consume, and I don't ask the origins. And then now that I've been more active about it, proactive, I find that I am consuming different content because I'm trying to support and trying to understand more content from content creators that don't necessarily get the spotlight. So then, like, I love the comments in the chat room, because the Manta Radio, I haven't, had the privilege of listening to it, but I've heard so much about it. But again, who's behind that? And obviously, it's a special group of people. But should other people also be involved in that? These are questions that I think we should continue to be asking. On the business side of things, just because I'm cognizant that I've been invited here, and I should probably always give a business context as well. I do think it's something we ask ourselves: what do we need to integrate into our our business atmosphere and our business environment? And for myself as a business leader, it doesn't sound very complex, but it is extremely hard. And I would say most businesses actually don't do these two things well. The first one is baselining, right? And baselining is just trying to understand where you are, where the problems exist, who's underrepresented, where is there issues with equality and inclusion, and where do we have issues with diversity? And I promise you, every single organization has issues, but most of the organizations don't know where those issues are. So the first and most important thing is baselining, and there's many ways of trying to address that. Of course, surveys, focus groups, and and some of these questions like asking where does the curriculum come from. And then the flip side then is setting targets. Again, it sounds really simple, it sounds really easy, but again, most companies either aren't that serious about it, or set targets that are not addressing the real issues that come from the baselining. So setting those KPIs and being the same way we would address, as long as we as a business address it the same way we would address our financial targets, it has to be aggressive, has to be realistic, it has to be something achievable, and it has to drive us towards our North Star, whatever that is. So you have to have that North Star, and you have to have these pretty aggressive targets, whether it be about diversity or sexual orientation, or different things that are happening in the business. You have to set those targets and be very aggressive in terms of how you hit those targets. If there's not a plan in place, and sometimes a week by week follow-up, these things are just not going to happen. So that's the kind of approach that I think we have to have in a business context, and probably the same thing we have to have in an academic context. And so it's just around being rigorous and being transparent in terms of our objectives. So I would say, yeah, that's probably where I'll leave off on this topic.
Thanks so much, Ken. Thank you, Amanda says. It's so interesting to hear these very specific examples of integration, and I'm loving this combination of kind of a corporate perspective with an educational perspective. Is fascinating. I'm just sitting here enjoying so much. So I'm wondering if from a business perspective or from an educational perspective, you're able to have that North Star like you've spoken to, Ken, and you're really like seeking that deliberate diversity. What has been your experience as panelists as far as the challenges that kind of model might present in a teaching and learning context or in a business context? What challenges are typical to that?
Yeah, so I alluded to a few as I was going through, but I wrote down the word KPI on here as you were going through there, Ken, because someone brought it up in a meeting we had today, and just thinking about performance indicators for diversity can sometimes be a bit like confronting, right? But the idea of like having a guiding, like the North Star, as you talked about, a place where we're going and how do we know when we get there is number one, the first challenge, right? Like, how do we know we are being successful at this? Could be, a much longer webinar and a much longer conversation between all of us. But for me, I think from my perspective and being in a secondary school, and I sat with this, and we've sat with this week as well here in a lot of ways and in a lot of conversations, is I think there's a balance between protecting and supporting those groups of people when we look at this deliberately diverse group that have been oppressed in the past, or part of that oppressed group, and preparing them with skills for the outside to cope. Like, can we create a bubble that protects people and has, safety, but also preparing for hard conversations that might happen in the world? And then balancing it's always a balancing act. I think that's the challenge, is how do we support this group without alienating this group? How do we have the inclusion portion, but through tough conversations, not through surface level inclusion, not just, please bring me your food and your flags and your festivals, but also how do we include the tough conversations about our differences, right? And the deep differences that we have. And how can we pull out those louder voices? I see someone's question in the chat, and I just, integrating different perspectives into the voices, right? How do we lift up the voices of people who want to fall silent in 2022 because they feel like their voices will get them ostracized, or lift up the voices of people who don't feel comfortable sharing their opinion for whatever reason? How do we balance that is a big challenge. And it's one that, I don't think anyone here would stand up and say, I figured it out, we've got it, no problem. But engaging with it in a real way, I think all of these balancing acts are the real challenges of being in a deliberately diverse community and really engaging with DEI, right? That's the part, is if you really want to engage, you have to do this balancing act, and you have to be willing to screw up and try again, and really, try and balance things as best as you can.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. And I think it's an interesting question because, at face value, when you have a deliberately diverse model, deliberately diverse team, you will have challenges up front that stem from diversity and stem from having different voices and different ideas and different cultural background, different contexts, different worldviews. And this obviously adds to friction and introduces new challenges. Of course, I think the audience on this just are this friction is because we end up being stronger with that friction, and we end up being the end result is, it's more rocky of a road to get there, but the end result is better. So I would just say that homogeneous groups, highly homogeneous groups, basically end up with less challenges, probably in a business context as well. Everyone basically suffers from groupthink, and then from a leadership point of view, maybe you find that to be advantageous. It's like, okay, everyone's already on the groupthink board, and we just move fast, and you can get to the outcome faster. And the KPIs everyone's aligned on the KPIs, and everyone runs, and you get there. But you never realize what you could have got to. You never realize what you missed out. You never realize how much more you could have achieved. So that's the part of the problem with the status quo, with the old system, with the systemic racism. You just never, you thought everything's perfect, everything is great, and you're just moving, and things seem very rosy. But when you enter into a deliberately diverse model for teaching and learning, or in a business context, you're introducing friction, and you're introducing much more difficulty in terms of achieving even objectives. Agreement, alignment will be much more challenging, right? But it's that whole process that it makes us stronger and makes us better, and just that whole fire that makes us coming out, as more valuable gold. And it's not just theoretical, right? So there has been quite a lot of research that shows heterogeneous groups outperforming homogeneous groups significantly. Whether it comes in a courtroom, so courtrooms, diverse juries outperform very homogeneous juries in terms of the rigor. So not only in terms of the decision making, but also the rigor and the depth of the decision making process, which is really awesome. And what was cool about this research, it's nothing to do with the intelligence level or the experience or the background of any of the participants. It's just the diversity in itself. Diversity in itself drives people being out of their comfort zone. It drives people being challenged, being uncomfortable, friction, all the words I mentioned earlier. And then people end up, not only the discussions between the diverse groups that are more powerful, people end up challenging themselves more before they maybe offer up a solution or a thought, because they want to make sure that their thoughts or ideas are well thought through. So even the rigor of one's own personal thinking is improved. So it's quite remarkable that that process is it happens, and the diverse groups. So just adding any kind of level of diversity is an improvement. Is basically the learning from some of this kind of traditional researches. So I would say, yeah, there's challenges, but the whole point is the challenges, and the challenges is what is really the benefit. Is really the currency we're looking for. So that's kind of where I would leave off.
Yeah, I would add that when we think about deliberate diversity, like there's two different ways that you can look at it. You can look at the external one about the organization and how we go about trying to deliberately have a diverse population and atmosphere at our school, a diverse environment. And then also like the internal deliberate diversity that we as individuals try to deliberately become more diverse in the way that we interact with the world and the way that we understand the world. The challenges that come about from this is that you have different expectations from the different groups that are involved in the education. When we look at the term actual deliberate diversity, this comes from the UWC as an overall organization, as a movement. And that's seen a lot in the NC students. So the final 2 years of the program, there is a format in place for us to be deliberately diverse and which students are coming to each campus to make sure that there's always a good demographic idea about the world. So we don't have one nationality all put into one one college, right? It's always try to be balanced and spread out. And the challenges for this is that the NC students are just the final 2 years. It's not the entirety of the program. So there's a different program that you don't always get to deliberately pick a complete balance of the nationalities. That being said, we still have a very diverse group in the primary, but it's a little bit different about the expectations of what that means. Different families will have different expectations of what education should give you and different pedagogical frameworks and perspectives to get there. So some cultures might prioritize academics and kind of like rote learning or the collection of information, whereas other ones would be more about concept-based and play-based or about well-being. And those can sometimes seem at odds with each other within any kind of school setting. At our school, we have both of those present, but sometimes the expectations about which one are you prioritizing can make it seem like it's difficult to achieve deliberate diversity. The way that I think about it for a personal, like intrinsic inside deliberate diversity, the challenges could be that not everybody has access to all the information in the world. So as a teacher, I want to make sure that I can meet every student where they are, understand where they're coming from, and then help them be the best person that they can be. That requires me understanding well who they are, where they come from, and what that means in the way that they're going to receive the education here and the way that they're going to receive information that I'm sharing with them. Which means that I have to be deliberately diverse in the way that I engage with language, the way that I engage with values, the way that I engage with formats, the way that I even engage with support for different students. And so the challenges are that as an educator, you have to really rise to the occasion, and you have to be very active in the way that you will go about learning about other cultures in order for you to be effective. And so I think the challenges are just that there's limitless cultures in the world, and we don't have an infinite amount of time. So it's about prioritizing how can I best learn about the world so that way I can best teach my kids about the world and about themselves. And that's always going to be a challenge.
It's wonderful, Sese. It makes me think of the wonderful comment that Emily put in the chat about stretching. So it's a constant stretching, perhaps, right? So moving on to the final question before we open up to our Q&A, I'm wondering, as you look at that need to kind of state a position to say, okay, as an organization, this is where we stand, and we're going to take some policies and write them, and they're going to be mission-based, which can be very, time consuming. Some would say it can also be quite trite, right? If it's not been implemented. How can you establish a bit of a priority and a balance there between the need for policy and the need for implementing initiatives?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I think, we've struggled with this on the UWC ARDEI Global Committee. We came together about, we probably came together about a year ago in terms of all the, including all the interviews and selection process to get on board the team. And then since joining, we've been trying to meet, as often as possible every other week. And, we're sitting all over the world. So in every single time zone. So there's a lot of challenges with that. And like Laurel, you mentioned, it's a heavy lift to align on the mission and to align on the objectives and to try and kind of scope our work to something that's actually manageable and achievable. And maybe some people would then start to criticize because, the whole process is a long time, And the question is, what have you done for me lately? And what do we have to show for this group coming together and meeting and all this kind of stuff? And we are starting to feel some of that heat, which is fine, which is good. I would say that it basically shouldn't be a balance in a sense, right? Because these two things are linked and are dependent. So just like, and here I risk sounding a little bit, businessy or overly executive in terms of the business world. But, if we start running around with initiatives without policies, then you just end up, you end up with activities. So what we want to avoid the risk of just being very busy. Like that's not helpful to anyone. Like we definitely don't want to be just busy bees and full of activities and trying to, even with the right heart, even with the right intentions, you end up spinning wheels and people end up being burnt out, and all the right people that had the right intentions, unfortunately those are the guys that leave first, or those are the men and women who leave first, right? And that hurts. So in order to protect your group of high energy, like the Amanda energy folks that are just like wanting to do something and wanting to have a huge impact, it's so critical to then spend some time up front and just setting the policies and setting the direction. We talked about KPIs, setting your vision, setting your North Star, until that's set. I would almost argue like don't even engage in any initiatives, right? Again, we're trying to protect our folks that have the energy, that have the ambition, that have the excitement. We want to put their power and their energy in the right direction. We want to point everyone going in the same way. So I would say let the friction, we talked about that stretching from Emily, let all that happen early, allow that to overwhelm you, or allow that to encompass you. Don't fall into the trap of running into initiatives, and just focus on setting yourself up right from the beginning, understanding truly what are your issues, what are you trying to solve, what's the scope, and what can you solve, in the different countries and different jurisdictions that we're all in. Those look quite different in different places, and then and allow that tension to build up, and don't fall into the trap of running and becoming busy bees. So that's kind of what I would say would be my caution and my advice to the team, is really spend the effort, even if it takes like us, like 8 months to 12 months to get yourself set up in terms of your mission-based policies. And then I think then you can charge ahead, kind of like 200 miles an hour, try and catch up on lost time. But I think then you end up being more productive, and I think the team that you engage will end up staying with you for longer, which is really important.
Yeah, I would like to add that you always have to balance both of them. Like I said, with DEI work, there's like an organizational aspect to it, and then there's the actual implementing the DEI. As a teacher myself, policies without initiatives does not help the students at all. I'm here to educate, so that's my priority. And always, I know that as there's a turnover with teachers and with students, that without policies, if anybody leaves that's instrumental to that initiative or to those programs, it could just fall flat. So we always have to have a policy that is in the back that can always move things forward whenever people are changing. But we have to have the initiatives as well, because ultimately that's what's going to engage the students. Me working with primary students, some of them don't read yet, right? Kindergartners, first graders, they don't read. So a policy to them is not something that they can even engage with or understand at all. And even if they do understand the words, it'll go right over their head developmentally. So I always have to make sure that I'm getting some type of contact with them, with understanding how to be inclusive, with how to be equitable in their day-to-day interactions at school, while I'm also taking care of policy in the background. And you have to move both of those things forward at the same time. If you go forward with just the initiatives and nothing to back it up, it could stop very, very quickly when one instrumental person is gone. And then if it's the opposite, yeah, likewise.
Yeah, just to add on to what these other folks have said, I think like balancing these two things, one of the terms that came out of my research was brave praxis, right? We need to try things, and then we need to fail, reflect, and try again. But we need to be brave in those things. And I agree with what Sese said, right? We need to balance. It's so hard to balance the time spent on policy and the time spent on doing. And sometimes the sticky bits that happen is that we want to change so quickly because something feels so important. And it's hard. We are going to sometimes go slower than people want in order to get things right. And that feels bad, because we want to do it right the first time. And maybe we're going to fail a little and keep going with that praxis, but we do need to be considerate and deliberate in the process. And sometimes that's going to upset people, that slowness. It's going to frustrate them. But we need to balance that time and consider the authenticity of the policy in line with what we're doing. Are we doing what the policy says? Can we do what the policy says? Those are really important questions that take time. And for me, one of the most important questions as a secondary school teacher is, are we balancing support and scaffolding for students to help them and guide them through this process with giving them the freedom to make choices and be student-led? That balance in policy and implementation is a very, very interesting dance. But I would agree with what Ken and Sese said. Overall, absolutely, just that, sometimes we do, like Laurel said in the chat, we need to go slow to go fast. And sometimes we need to go fast, but most of the time we need to go slow to go fast. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So we're going to move on to our question and answer session. We've had a few questions pop up in the chat, but if you have a question that you would like to ask, please feel free to raise your digital hand or throw that into the chat box. One question for you, Ken, that broke into the chat. Do you have any specific examples from a business standpoint of some KPIs that you have used in relation to DEI initiatives?
Yeah. In fact, I was having an offline conversation with Raquel. So thanks to Raquel for the question. So yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. So I wanted to clarify that KPIs stand for key performance indicators, and usually we break them into both leading and lagging indicators. And leading, of course, being kind of driving you towards your goal, and lagging being something you're trying to measure. What you're trying to measure. So an example, very, very high level and very kind of generic, could be both in a business context and in a UWC DEI context, could be, for example, we endeavor to have, let's say, 50% of women in executive leadership positions, by the end of the year or within 2 years. So that's kind of what I would call a lagging indicator, because at the end of 2 years you measure it, you either hit it or you didn't. And if you hit it, then it's already done. And if you didn't, then nothing you can do about it. It doesn't help you. Actually, doesn't help you very much. Right? It's just a KPI. But leading KPIs are cool because they help you get to your goal, right? So you could have a leading KPI which says, okay, we want to make sure that if we know that the overall KPI is to get women in leadership. And so then maybe we say we recognize that in the interview pipeline right now, all the people interviewing are men. So you end up with the situation you have now. So you say, look, in every single interview we have, the panel must have, at least 50% women on the panel interviewing. So that's kind of what I would call a leading indicator. So you set the KPI, you measure it, and if you hit the KPI, it will get you towards your overall KPI. So I just wanted to point that out. It's really good to have a mix of those two types of KPIs.
Like a master class in business, Ken. I love it. Thank you for that. Another question that came into the chat was in regards to hard conversations. And I think this might be, frankly, I think it was probably asked about children, but sometimes as adults, I think we could probably upskill a bit in having hard conversations. Does anyone want to tackle the question of, do you have any specific skills that you teach or frameworks that you use in order to hold courageous conversations or difficult conversations? Amanda, I think you've got something you might want to share.
Yeah, I think it's from a teaching perspective, it's personal. It's you being open. It takes time, right? I know that's, again, it's going slow to go fast. We were talking about this actually today. it takes time to build relationships and build community with a group of students in a classroom to the point where a student feels comfortable enough to share an opinion that is not in the norm of the people in the room. And for those people to know that they are safe to share that, and the other people to know that, just like, Emily had put in the chat, that we're not going to attack someone's humanity, but we are going to talk about difficult things. We can sit in that difficult space and we can stretch, but we're not going to be harmful. And the students need to trust in you that you are going to keep them safe in that conversation, and that you can, while being uncomfortable. And as a teacher, sometimes you are going to, you're going to be uncomfortable, and students will share things that you don't agree with, and you need to sit enough with yourself to be okay with it, to model it for them. And maybe that's not a concrete, graphic organizer you can use, but that is, bringing your whole self into the place. Parker J. Palmer's whole work is to bring your whole self into that place, the space, and it will lead to that community building, and that connection will lead to that place.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we didn't talk a lot today in our webinar about the knowledge of self, but my goodness, is it important? Maybe the last question that we'll take today is regarding frictions. And so if you were to have a moment of friction between students that has some sort of relation with diversity, how would you then handle that?
I can share that. I mean, the one good thing that we have, not one good thing, one of the positive things that we have being in IB is that you lean into the inquiry. When you have a question, when there is some type of issue, it's a perfect place to unpack it. And so as a teacher, whenever we are dealing with certain provocations or prompts we talk about with the students, whether it's about people migrating for reasons that they don't want to, or whether it's talking about differences in people based on the way that they think or the way that they act or the way that they can engage with the world because of their abilities or disabilities. Anytime that we see these frictions as students, it's a perfect opportunity to talk about it. In the primary school, anytime that we see any students that have maybe some friction because of where they come from, or maybe just like their value systems that they're bringing into the school, we give them the space to talk about it, and we really honor that moment as a teaching moment. We never shy away from those in the primary. If we notice that students are not agreeing on something because of a fundamental cultural difference, we talk about how do we think differently and why do we have these cultural differences, and are there any middle grounds where we can both be respectful to each other, and are there ways that we can both grow, and maybe understanding that we all need to have that responsibility to grow. And I think in the primary, the students are pretty good with that. Thankfully, in this school, I'm very lucky that I don't notice a lot of cultural frictions within the primary school. And as a teacher, that makes me feel very proud that hopefully we're a reason for that. But in general, I think that our students have been educated well in the primary to be able to understand that when they do have differences, that they need to kind of think about how to bridge that gap, that responsibility is on them. And I'm very thankful that our students are that compassionate and have a close enough understanding to themselves that they're willing to put themselves in that space. But we deal with the friction when it comes. We don't shy away from it.
Yeah, I'll add one comment to that. I love it. I 100% agree. I love what Rosemary shared in the chat, that if we don't talk it out, we end up acting it out. So yeah, the one thing I'll add there is basically when you see some friction or you hear something, and in the past we encourage folks to call people out, and so more recently I've been encouraging folks and been encouraging myself as well to instead call people in, right? So it's not so much about calling people out, it's really more about calling people in, and then loving the friction, loving the mistake someone made, and encouraging folks to quickly get around the table and huddle and let's talk it out now. And we're not trying to embarrass you, Mr. or Mrs. for the comment you made, but let's talk it out now. Let's get together. And I've had that situation happen, with a very senior professor at the University of Michigan, making a comment about, the University of Michigan guidelines, trying to increase diversity among the students. He made the comment that, I hope these new guidelines don't reduce the standard of our school. And it was an offensive comment. It would have been easy for me to just call him out, and because I was offended personally. And so, but then in a public way, we actually organized a dinner. Got about 10 of us together, we did mention that this was a topic we wanted to address. We got together, and personally, I'm very close with the professor now, and it wouldn't have ended up that way, right? If we just had been aggressive about it. So we didn't end up agreeing. I would say that he still was very much set in his ways, and he's much more senior and more respected than I am. So it is what it is. But I do think it was a valuable exchange, and we have one friendship, at least one plus friendship to take away from it. So yeah, I think that concept is 100% with you, Sese. Let's just have the conversation for the value of the conversation alone.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that anecdote, Ken. It's so important. And thank you to everyone who's participated in the chat. If we weren't able to comment directly on what you've been able to share, know that we'll get back to you. And thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us today. We end our webinars always with a little bit of information about UWC Thailand. I know a lot of people come curious what a UWC is. So if you're curious to see kind of a little glimpse into who we are and what we do, you're welcome to stay for our video that's going to come on the screen in just a second. If you need to pop out before then, no worries whatsoever. And we'll hope to see you at some upcoming webinars we have. Thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Ken, Sese, and Amanda. We appreciate everyone for their time today. Thank you. Every time I watch that video, I want to be a student again. How come my school wasn't like that, right? Our very next webinar is the power of inquiry-based learning. So if you're especially motivated by the primary years program of the IB curriculum or interested in how that might extend into middle and diploma years, we'd love to have you join us. After that, we've got the case for personal challenge, which is a huge highlight of our outdoor education programming. We've got a mindfulness webinar coming. So lots of learning available to those of you interested in what we have to offer. And we'll we'll hope that we see you here next time. Thank you again to Ken Kuguru, Amanda Molnar, excuse me, and Cese Ovelar. Very appreciative for your time today. And thank you to you all for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye, everyone.